is that for all practical purposes, my book is perhaps an inadvertent rebuttal of yours. Hindutva was not coined by Savarkar. Hindutva was coined by Chandranath Boshu in 1892. I am happy to completely discard Savarkar, and I'm sure this is going to get me a lot of hate mails, because I've seen the tone as well as the manner in which you refer to him. I'm absolutely sure that it's not possible for us to glorify all parts of any individual. You would agree with that. Be it Mahatma Gandhi, or at least I refer to him as Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. I choose not to refer to him as Mahatma Gandhi. I'm actually happy you said that. Because while Swami Vivekananda was happy to speak of universalism and universal brotherhood from the podium of the Parliament of Religions in Chicago, where he specifically refers to his encounter with a Christian missionary on a ship either back to or from India, where a Christian missionary was constantly spewing venom against the religion of Satan, which is Hinduism, Swami Vivekananda, despite his belief in universal brotherhood, was forced to catch the Christian missionary by the scruff of his collar and threatened him with throwing him overboard. If I may say so, that according to me is Hindutva or Hindu resistance in action.
Yes. Say, and what would you like to ask, Shashi?
Am I audible? Am I audible? Yeah? Yeah, okay.
You're holding it, I think, helps.
Oh, okay. So, first of all, thank you, Dr. Krishna, for giving me an opportunity to share space with Dr. Tharoor, and congratulations on your book, sir. I've had the opportunity to go through it, at least the important portions of it, and as someone who typically doesn't use a pen to mark on a book, I was forced to do it this time because there are certain aspects that I came across. The one thing that I certainly agree with Dr. Krishna on is that for all practical purposes, my book is perhaps an inadvertent rebuttal of yours. And my book was released on August 13th. Last week was actually the Chennai release, so to speak. And the good thing that I've done, and this is not an attempt at self-edification, is that I have steered clear of all the Hindutva ideologues, so to speak, in building my case, which is that there is no reference to Savarkar whatsoever. There is no reference whatsoever to even Tagore or Gandhi or anybody else for that matter. And let me start with perhaps a factual correction. Kindly indulge me. Hindutva was not coined by Savarkar. Hindutva was coined by Chandranath Boshu in 1892 in his essay on Hindutva specifically. Long before Savarkar actually wrote on the subject, someone had already thought of it and had actually fleshed out its embodiment, so to speak, and Chandranath Boshu. Yes. So Hindutva, unfortunately or fortunately, is attributed to the mind of Savarkar when in fact it's not. So that's the first factual correction. Second, I wouldn't dare use the word criticism because I would be stepping into too large shoes. I wouldn't do that. But my own impression of your book is that perhaps it takes a truncated view of what people crudely dub as Hindu nationalism. I have addressed certain parts of that actually as part of my book. The idea is to place the current movement and the awakening of this particular society within the larger canvas of what global scholarship refers to as decoloniality, which is to basically say that post-colonial societies are trying to shed the baggage of post-colonialism and wear the lens of decoloniality to be able to re-access their past and not recreate their past, but to re-inscribe certain values of the past in the institutions of the present and hopefully chart a more indigenous future. But it's not possible to completely create an indigenous future simply because it happens to be an integrated world. And that's the reality that you have to deal with and actively engage with. So the idea is to create perhaps a hybrid future which has a greater quotient of indigeneity as opposed to coloniality. Let me say this with as much humility as I can marshal at this point, that perhaps your previous book on the British colonial period, as well as this book, completely miss the scholarship of decoloniality, because unfortunately, Bharat's experience with colonialism is being approached with a blinkered vision, and I'm making a reference to a general school of thought, and I'm not making this personal at all. Because the idea that Hindu nationalism is fundamentally exclusionist and comes to the detriment of and at the peril of religious minorities in this country is to impose the guilt as well as the framework of European nationalism on Bharatiya consciousness. And every mistake and every folly and every massacre or every genocide which was perpetrated in the name of European nationalism is somehow consciously and unconsciously sought to be transposed onto Bharatiya reawakening. I do not wish to call it Hindutva, I do not wish to call it, let's say, any Twa, so to speak. I will simply call it Bharatiya Dharmic Civilizational Reawakening, which is what it translates to. The problem is, unfortunately, whenever this discussion starts, we seem to be fixated with certain personalities, which is Savarkar, so on and so forth. I am happy to completely discard Savarkar, and I'm sure this is going to get me a lot of hate mail, completely discard Savarkar to build a case for Hindu civilizationalism or Dharmic civilizationalism, because it is possible to do so. And the concept of Dharmic civilizationalism is much larger than any single individual. And to box it and lay it at the doors entirely of one particular person simply because he comes from an inconvenient political camp, so to speak, or espouses a certain cause that may not be politically correct, would be to do grave injustice to the society using one particular individual as the strawman of the argument. So therefore, it is my position, and I say this with all humility, that with due respect to Sri Savarkar and his contributions, because I've seen the tone as well as the manner in which you refer to him, I'm absolutely sure that it's not possible for us to glorify all parts of any individual. You would agree with that. Be it Mahatma Gandhi, or at least I refer to him as Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. I choose not to refer to him as Mahatma Gandhi. Pardon me for saying so. Or for that matter, Dr. Ambedkar. I don't think there is a single individual, if you choose to start scrutinizing them, that you would find yourself agreeing with all parts of everything that they say. Be that as it may, you try and make do with those parts which you believe, define them, characterize them. Therefore, for all his flaws and whatever they may be, Savarkar was effectively putting forth a position which was already in public domain, and he was capturing a certain spirit. But be that as it may, I don't wish to be the mouthpiece of Savarkar here. The point is, it is possible, and it must be so, that you look at this particular concept of Dharmic civilizationalism independent of the lens of European nationalism. Unfortunately, the moment this discussion starts, I think people start cherry picking certain facts, which is that the constitution is fundamentally antithetical to, or is it loggerheads with, the Hindutva vision of a Hindu Rashtra, so to speak. So perhaps you may want to look at the draft constitution that was presented by the Hindu Mahasabha, which actually promised equal rights to religious minorities. And the reason why this is important for us to point out is because, assuming for a moment that we did not have the concept of contemporary constitutionalism emanating from Europe, even then, Bharat as a civilization has always welcomed those people who are willing to live with us. We did not have a constitution when persecuted Parsis knocked at the doors of Bharat. We did not have a constitution when, let's say, the Jews from your state, so to speak, and even from the Northeast, knocked at the doors of Bharat. So to attribute certain large-heartedness entirely to the constitution, I would say, is to protect the constitution at the expense of the civilization, which I think is grave injustice, grave injustice.
I've never done that.
I'll just finish my point.
When you finish.
So as far as I'm concerned, to assume that the constitution is somehow a civilizing tool which seeks to educate and civilize and, let's say, uplift a certain regressive society, which is at loggerheads with the value of constitutionalism, which doesn't know what is democracy, which doesn't know what it is to accommodate minorities, no. It is a product of the fundamental spirit of this particular land. And despite the horrors of partition, which we must never forget, despite the reality and tragedy of partition, which we must never forget, despite the reality of the two-nation theory, which was specifically foisted on us, which we must never forget, I think this country has done a vastly superior job of protecting its minorities than our former let's say, estranged cousins, so to speak. And I think the proof of that lies in the fact. So it actually is very, very surprising when we are constantly told that this particular country, if it becomes a Hindu Rashtra or if it becomes a Dharmic civilizational state, so to speak, is bound to become what you refer to in your book as the Hindu Pakistan. I'm sorry, I think that's grave injustice to the people of this country, because accommodation is something, an accommodation, not Western style assimilation. Accommodation has been the spirit of this country, because Western style assimilation requires you to convert to their way of life in one form or the other, either overtly or covertly, in order for you to be accepted as part of the particular society. It is this country that makes it possible for people to keep their culture alive in the most perhaps pristine form possible, so long as it does not come in the way of others. So I would actually make the case that Dharmic civilizationalism is what is crudely dubbed as Hindu nationalism. And as a student of constitutional law, not to claim specific expertise or drop names here, I believe that whenever public morality has been referred to in the Constituent Assembly debates, the reference has been to the reservoir of this country's public morality drawn from the vast ocean of dharma. And as far as I understand, the concept of dharma is native to this particular land, so to speak, and its culture. And there is one clarification or correction that I think is very, very important, that it's possible to simply reduce the so-called Indic reawakening, so to speak, as identity politics. It's possible to muddle it to the level of identity politics. In my humble opinion, that would be perhaps the most superficial way of looking at it, because scholarship, psychology, political science, as well as students of history strike a very clear distinction between identity and consciousness, which is to say you can be a Hindu in name and still think like a foreigner, because your language and your accent and everything could be something that is completely alien to this land. So according to me, identity is less important and consciousness is more important, which is why if I had to choose between an Aurangzeb and Dara Shikoh, I would choose a Dara Shikoh simply because in consciousness, he was closer to the Hindu spirit, notwithstanding his identity. But Aurangzeb, for all practical purposes, his consciousness and identity were one and the same and completely antithetical to the nature of this land and its accommodative spirit. So that is the distinction. And the third point that I think needs to be made very, very clearly, because Savarkar's work, whether it is capable of being misinterpreted, misconstrued, or interpreted in the right manner, is not the touchstone of Indic Renaissance, because it is the typical strawman. One of the strawmans that's created is to basically say Hindutva is ethnocentric, it has a certain obsession with race, and therefore in its rejection of religious minorities, it is merely presenting another form of xenophobia. The fact of the matter is this land has accommodated several races, and not all of these races are necessarily native to what we understand as Bharat. They have come from several parts of the world, but have ultimately become part of this particular land simply because their way of life has managed to find a way of coexisting with us without actually having a fundamental principle which sees us.
But I see has taken some notes, so I look forward to hearing his counter thrust and to responding to it.
So, in the interest of time, am I audible? Yes. In the interest of time, I will stick to specific points made by Dr. Tharoor. First is that he believes that the Hindutva that he subscribes to, or the Hinduness that he subscribes to, is that of Swami Vivekananda. I'm actually happy you said that, because while Swami Vivekananda was happy to speak of universalism and universal brotherhood from the podium of the Parliament of Religions in Chicago, he was very, very clear that universalism cannot come at the expense of pixelation of history, and certainly specific disagreements, theological disagreements, which resulted in constant practice of exactly this value called toleration, this civilizing, condescending virtue called toleration, which was resulting in the proselytization of Indians en masse. So much so that at least in two of his works, I'm sure you're aware of it, sir, where he specifically refers to his encounter with a Christian missionary on a ship either back to or from India, where a Christian missionary was constantly spewing venom against the religion of Satan, which is Hinduism. Swami Vivekananda, despite his belief in universal brotherhood, was forced to catch the Christian missionary by the scruff of his collar and threaten him with throwing him overboard. if I may if I may say so, that according to me is Hindutva or Hindu resistance in action, which is to say, I'm more than happy to accommodate all your points of view, provided you first stop spewing venom against me in the name of your scripture. So the very same Swami Vivekananda, I'm so happy that you've actually cited him, also went on to identify in, let's say, book after book after book, in fact in several tomes, the history of invasions from the 8th century at least until the 16th century. And this is something that he has never pixelated. So the great thing about these stalwarts or civilizational icons is that they were very clear that there is no inconsistency between recognition of the universal character of dharma and what dharmic communities and civilizations have been subjected to in the name of vidharma. Let's not call it adharma, let's call it vidharma. This is something that is starkly missing, and that's exactly what I've pointed in my book, which is to say that there is a filter called coloniality or colonial consciousness, which actively prevents this particular country, and specifically the majority of this country, from accessing specific aspects of its past and putting it in deep slumber in the name of secularism, because just as you have a problem with, let's say, the concept of tolerance, so to speak, European history, and I'm absolutely sure you're aware of this, is specifically clear about the Christian origins and Christian nature of secularism itself. Such being the case, I think when this particular community stands up and says, I have had enough of secularism and I've had enough of this inclusivity that is specifically telling me forget everything, you keep citing Dalits, you keep citing everybody else, but you don't wish to talk about the treatment of Kashmiri Hindus and the specific causes behind it. You don't wish to talk about what exactly has happened in Bengal immediately after elections from the 2nd of May. You don't wish to talk about, let's say, certain pockets being created in Assam in the name of religion, dare I say. You don't wish to talk about what is, according to me, the longest running insurgency in this country, which is the creation of a crown colony in the northeast, and therefore there is Nagalim for something. Please Google up what they specifically are fighting for. It's Nagalim for, and a religious figure is specifically mentioned. With all these insurgencies going on, surprisingly, it is the Hindu who is the constant subject of scrutiny, whereas everybody else is spared scrutiny and the rod. So therefore the point is, the Hindu has proved herself, not himself, herself, because Sabrimala, herself, to be more than open to reform in every possible way, because way before untouchability was abolished under Article 17 of the Constitution, the temple entry movement was initiated by the Maharaja of Travancore in 1936. That was already done. So several people, inward-looking people, were more than happy, if at all the Dharma Shastras warranted it, they were more than happy to say, we have to move on. So therefore, I'm merely saying that this particular community perhaps doesn't get the credit that it deserves, and it gets, let's say, more scrutiny than it deserves, whereas everybody else is spared scrutiny. That's point number one. Point number two, any concept must be understood, as Dr. Tharoor rightly points out, in historical context. I completely understand, but it should not be divorced from the unique cultural experience and historical experience of any community. So nationalism, when spouted by a European who is fundamentally a colonizer, is not the same as nationalism from Savarkar or anybody else who is the victim of colonization at the end of the day, who has witnessed two successive waves of colonization running for at least 1400 years. So to say that when we speak of nationalism, it's the same as European supremacism, I'm sorry to say, is to compare apples with oranges, where you're divorcing the entire history and focusing exclusively on the statement. Here, when we speak of nationalism, it is merely a call for throwing off the yoke of colonialism of two kinds. Therefore, this should not be compared with Europeans for the simple reason that you're comparing the victim with the oppressor and the aggressor. That, according to me, there couldn't have been a greater insult to a victimized and a colonized community. That's point number two. And I'll just make one more point, which is Constitution. Of course, it's a fine document, it's a great document, it must be worshipped. Yes, I get all of that. But the point is, Dr. Ambedkar, after having crafted this constitution, during the Nehruvian dispensation, rues the fact that he actually created this constitution because he was seeing it distorted under the Nehruvian dispensation, and he says very clearly that I regret the day that I was given this particular task of having to draft this particular document, because now I realize that a terrible piece of document can be used for the betterment of the people in the hands of good people, but a fantastic piece of document and legal document can be completely misused in the hands of scoundrels. I don't, and this I'm not even paraphrasing, I'm using his words exactly. So therefore, the fact of the matter is, the chairman of the drafting committee of the Constitution regretted having to live during his lifetime to see the Constitution and its values being completely thrown to the winds. That's point number 3. And the last point that I think is extremely important is the reference to Diana Eck, her book called India, a Sacred Geography. Surprisingly, when she refers to India, a Sacred Geography, she chooses not to refer to it as Bharat. She still focuses on India, which is exactly why I decided to call my book India, that is Bharat, because Article 1 speaks of India, that is Bharat. Unfortunately, Bharat has been effectively relegated to the margins, whereas India is currently surviving at the expense of Bharat. The problem is, if you look at the introduction of Diana Eck's book, because I've had the specific opportunity to deal with it in my book, she recognizes the fact that as far as this country is concerned, it was created as a consequence of a network of pilgrimage centers. And therefore, there's a triple matrix of nature, culture, faith, epistemology, and patriotism coming together to create this entity called Bharat. But there again, she says, but Hindu nationalism, no. So the problem is, it's surprising that she regurgitates the very same scholarship of Radhakumar Mukherjee of 1914. She comes out with the very same scholarship on sacred geography of Jadunath Sarkar, of R.C. Majumdar. But we are more than...
No, you need the mic because it's being broadcast on YouTube and Zoom. So they won't hear you without the mic.
I'm Srijit Sai.
Keep it very close to you.
I'm Srijit Sai and
Much
I'm a
better.
student of information technology.
I'm sorry?
A student of information technology.
Okay.
So on the 23rd, last month, you referred to as the Malabar Hindu genocide as a false memory. What about this is a false
As
memory? False memory.
No, I mean, I think what I said was, historians have written reams about all of this. There are multiple views. There are at least 3 different interpretations I can identify about what happened in the so-called Mapla rebellion and so on. There is if you like, the leftist view that it was essentially a class struggle between oppressed peasants and oppressive landlords and the colonial power. It so happened that the oppressed peasants were overwhelmingly Muslim and the oppressive landlords were overwhelmingly Hindu, and that's why the communal coloring. That's one view. There is indeed the view of what you call the Hindu genocide, which sees it very much through the prism of the assaults on Hindus that took place. So that also took place in the later part of the rebellion. The initial rebellion did not have a communal coloring, but I'll concede that aspects of it did gain that. There's also a third view, which points to the complexity of going with either the first or the second view. First of all, the geographical differences. In different parts of Malabar, you had different experiences. There are anecdotes after anecdotes of Muslim sheltering Hindus and Hindu sheltering Muslims and so on. It was not a straightforward as we've seen, frankly, in the riots that sadly have benighted our country even in the last 30 years, there have been human beings reaching out across the communal divide, and it was not one of this kind of unquestioning identification with the religious community. And that there was also no doubt about the anti-colonial aspects of many of the stands taken. And therefore, because of the complexity of all this, to reduce these 3 as I said, at least 3, because there are others. I think the Hindu, or one of the papers, I think it was the Hindu, had a rather lengthy article, perhaps in the Kerala edition, that gave all the multiple possibilities. I said that it would be unwise to go for any one of them. Yes, it is a false memory to reduce all of this to just one interpretation. And I think that in many ways, one of the interesting things about history is that you can read multiple accounts of the same events and come to your own conclusions depending on the prism through which you see them. And I will be amongst the first to admit that no one view is necessarily superior to another, but that definitely the duty of the historian is to dig up as much material as available and put it out there, and that after all history writing is subjective. I concede my attack on British colonialism omitted certain good things the British did. Or at least that they feel that they were good things that they did, though I don't believe they did them for us. That's another matter. The truth is that in looking at the vast amount of information out there, you select the points and facts that suit a particular narrative, and that's what I think those who take either just the peasants versus landlords view or just the Hindu versus Muslim view are also doing. I think the story is much more complex than either of those narratives.
I respectfully disagree with you, but...
Yeah, sure. But that's the point about history. We can disagree. and you can give me footnoted facts for your interpretation, and I can find the same for you.
On this question, I'd like to weigh in. It's important because I would not be doing justice to my own position on this particular subject if I didn't speak up on the subject. Be it in journalism or history, I think it is currently boxed by the tyranny of what I call forced symmetry and balance, which is to say that you throw up three different views and say all of them are equally valid, and therefore you must leave it to people to choose which of these is most comfortable to their position, as opposed to focusing on the more objective aspects of history which are demonstrable through clear evidence and facts. How do you judge whether an incident has a communal, let's say, flavor to it, or let's say a communal tinge to it or not, is not just on the basis of who was killed and who are the perpetrators, but on the basis of stated goals and intentions. Let us not forget that as far as that movement is concerned, the larger goal was to actually express solidarity with the establishment of the Ottoman Caliphate, so to speak, and to say that the dismantling of that particular caliphate is an attack on Islam, so to speak. Therefore, to say that this was a peasant rebellion, 20 years down the line, we'll have the very same historians saying that because most of the best houses in Kashmir were owned by Kashmiri Hindus, what happened there was again a rebellion of the proletariat, so to speak. That's what we'll be told next. In fact, that theory has already started, that the problem that most of the people had there was because of the affluence of Kashmiri Hindus. Therefore, what happened there was the same thing. You have another line of history basically saying that the person who demolished Somnath 12 times was doing this to effectively free the people from the oppression of the Brahmin there. Even that history has started. So therefore, I'm sorry to say this can't be accepted, because the fact of the matter is there is a clear solidarity with a movement which is Islamic in nature. Second, you see both the Hindu landlords as well as the British colonial masters, so to speak, as co-conspirators who are holding on to lands belonging to a particular religion. Clearly, the communal flavor of that particular entire movement is out in the open. There is really nothing to judge after that. The fact that a few people who were killed also belong to the same religion of the perpetrators doesn't change the fact that the intentions were clearly communal in nature. Most importantly, it is to the credit of a lot of people who must have sheltered Hindus, no doubt. But let us not obfuscate and indulge in obfuscation when we say that the intention behind the, or let's say the trigger behind the movement was manifestly, avowedly, irrefutably and undoubtedly communal in nature. That is something that must be accepted, because otherwise we will start laying the groundwork for, let's say, for apologia for everything that has happened in this country. I mean, if we are absolutely clear about what happened in 2002 in another part of the country, giving it a religious flavor, why is it that we are so hell-bent on whitewashing everything else? I think the only competitor here, I'm sorry, the only competitor here is Asian Paints or Nerolac. They're doing a better job of whitewashing facts.
This incident is not even mentioned in this book, so this honestly has nothing to do with the book launch we're doing today. But I should mention that there was a Khilafat movement which the mainstream political parties, including the nationalist movement under Mahatma Gandhi, had endorsed. And it took various forms throughout the country, mostly peaceful, and in some places the movement descended into violence, number one. But the Khilafat movement was not purely a Muslim movement, because non-Muslims were officially identified with supporting it, starting with Mahatma Gandhi and the Indian National Congress of the day. Secondly, if you read, for example, there's a letter published in the Hindu in Madras by the man whom the Hindutva movement today loves to demonize, Varim Kunat Muhammad Haji, who was the man who was then finally caught, arrested and executed by the British, and who is demonized today as this communal slayer, and who in his lifetime wrote to the Hindu and insisted they publish it and threatened the Hindu with violence if they didn't publish it, saying that as far as he was concerned, you know, there was nothing communal about agitation, there were Hindus fighting on his side, and that people of any faith would be welcome to take refuge in his lands, which at that point were not under British control, and that he was essentially there to fight against colonial oppression. Now, when there are contemporary documents speaking to a different interpretation of somebody's view, now this chap, this poor fellow, the Indian Council of Historical Research has decided to strike his name from the list of martyrs of British colonialism in which he has appeared for decades, because suddenly he is being demonized as communal. I despair, because I mean, you know, this is the fellow's own words that you're talking about that are being disregarded in favor of somebody else's demonization of his role in this rebellion. But as I say, none of this has anything to do with my book, or indeed with the notion of nationalism. Neither him nor those who extol him today have turned out to be anti-national or have left India for Pakistan or anything like that. So let's stay where we are on the battle of belonging. They all belong.
Okay.
Perhaps Dr. Ambedkar has said a lot on this particular subject. You must read on this.
I think we'll take one question there. I think we've had a lot of...
But do confine yourself, if you don't mind, to the issues in this
Yeah,
book.
please don't go off the subject like this Mopla rebellion.